Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. As always, I'm in need of your support, and the best way you can do that is by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack. I produce a weekly analysis and organize Zoom calls off the record with supporters to shoot the breeze on world events. You can also donate through the website, purchase a consult. If you want to chat with me, do check out all of my affiliates. And joining us for the very first time on Geopolitics and Empire is Jeffrey Peel of thenewera.uk. Welcome to the podcast, Jeff.
Thank you very much indeed. Lovely to be here, and I have so much respect for the work that you do. And I've watched many of your interviews, and they're every time even more fascinating.
Yeah, thanks. Somehow I came across you on X, and I'm like, this guy. The comments that you make, your website, your blog, your podcast, and you're on frequency. And just before going further, is there anything you'd like to add about your background, yourself, and the work that you're doing at New Era?
The New Era was a sort of act of expediency, a bit like you. I think, I know you've been going longer, and I think maybe you had some awareness of what was going on before many of us, and I think the COVID era was the great awakening call for many of us. But the New Era was an act of expedience. I just wanted to be able to express myself about the madness and craziness that was going on. But up to the point that I started that, I had just been an ordinary jobbing, consultant working in the world of business. My most recent experience prior to the COVID event was ironically working for the government as a consultant. And ironically, again, given the nature of the conversation we're going to be having, I was focused on technology. So I was working for the Department of Trade in the United Kingdom and helping get typically US companies, but also Australia, New Zealand companies to enter the UK and to set up shop here. So I was working for the government in tech. And then the COVID event happened, and suddenly I kind of realized that perhaps tech was right at the center of this new world order, this new era. And when I first started out, I was writing particularly about how sort of nefarious technology players were very active. I started noticing companies like Palantir and so on and entering the United Kingdom market. The mafia, the PayPal mafia getting involved increasingly in a lot of these companies. And as a result, I started focusing particularly on technology markets and some of these technology companies. And then it widened because I realized, when I watched your interview with Phil Wiseman, who was talking about the agenda, Agenda 2030. And I started putting together some of these pieces. And the New Era, my output, by the way, isn't as voluminous as yours. But the New Era was an attempt to interview some of the people who were, thought leaders, to use that awful term, but, who were looking in depth at what was going on and trying to give them some airtime because a lot of them had been deplatformed. I think I've interviewed many people that you've also interviewed. And so that's where it kind of came from. So I sort of fell into this whole world of alternative journalism, I suppose. It's been a fascinating experience, and I'm continuing to do it. I'm also writing a book at the minute as well, a novel, because I thought I would like to sort of shrink wrap an awful lot of my thoughts and perspectives relating to the agenda, if you call it that, into a novel format. So I've been working on that for the last few months as well. So my output on the New Era has not been as great as it should be. So that's been my focus recently.
And before getting your further thoughts on the agenda, I had this question for you because, again, I think we're both on point here. I wanted to take a cue from some of my listeners, and I like talking to everyone, and sometimes I platform. I talk to people across the spectrum, but sometimes I'll talk to left liberal globalists who might be experts in their field, some of which invite themselves on. Agencies that push guests. But I'm noticing a few people are getting tired of BS. The hour is late, and they want unbridled truth. And we know people are tired of mainstream media, but I'm sensing now people are getting tired of mainstream alternative media as well. And so I'm going forward. I'm going to take a cue from folks, and talk, thinking of talking more with people such as yourself, people who really understand the conspiratorial nature of things, so to speak. Just any thought on this? Have you sort of noticed this as well?
Yeah, absolutely. There were a number of people that I worked with in the early days. In fact, I even interviewed some of them, and it became clear as I got to know them more that there was an agenda. It's clear that particularly the intelligence agencies have been involved in psychological operations using mainstream media, but it's not a great leap to realize that perhaps some of these same agencies have also been using controlled alternative media organizations to get their message out. And to some extent, it's a theme, an underlying theme of the book I'm writing at the minute, because I got to a stage where I didn't know who I could trust. And there were many, and it's the case, obviously, in terms of Twitter, for example, when Linda Yaccarino was appointed, to Twitter, she made that famous comment, it's about freedom of speech, but not necessarily freedom of reach, So it's clear that on X, there are certain people, I like to think, refer to them as sort of sycophants, Musk sycophants, who will go with, they'll keep everything within the Overton window, but they won't, look outside that window at a vista of control and coercion. So they'll only touch on subjects that are deemed appropriate, particularly for the new Trump administration. So for me, it has been a case of sort of unpicking all of these alternative media sources, and I suppose it's why, like you, I've kind of become more of a lone wolf. I have to, because I just can't trust organizations or media entities or spokespeople or thought leaders or whatever they want to call themselves who have achieved that great reach, because I'm always questioning, how did they do that? Because I haven't been able to. I think I've been at 29,700 followers on Twitter for 2 years now. And as soon as I get up to 29,800, I magically lose 50 again. I always am pulled back to that number. I have no idea what's going on. But I think I made a video for the new era where I specifically focused on Linda Yaccarino's appointment, because she came from the world of advertising. I think she worked for NBC Universal or whatever before, and focused on that statement that she made. And it was from that point on that I noticed that my traction just disappeared. So I obviously I identified the Achilles heel of this nonsense statement that Musk keeps making, that he's committed to freedom of speech, because he clearly is not. And I don't really see any difference between X and Twitter. I think they're one and the same organization. In fact, I'll give you an example of that. Several years ago, prior to COVID, I ran an event in London, and it was focused on tech, particularly on social media. And I had, speaking at that event, a guy who was a representative from one of the supposedly free market think tanks in the UK. His name was Nick Pickles. And he spoke at the event, and he said all the right things on the panel. But then a few months later, he was appointed as head of government affairs for Twitter. And then, of course, Twitter was acquired by Musk. And of course, during that period, many of us were deplatformed on Twitter, or maybe replatformed or suspended, and a lot of the people that I knew were being suspended. But the interesting thing was Musk went in, and of course, there was the Matt Taibbi thing where, all the Twitter files were exposed. But the interesting thing was that Nick Pickles remained in post. He remained in post during that whole Twitter period, when he knew that the FBI and the CIA were actively involved in censoring content, and even had staffers on board. But then he continued on after that period. I think he's now moved on. But I thought, how strange that somebody could have worked in both Twitter and X in a government affairs role. So clearly, there's a lot of controlled opposition going on, and the actors, and I think increasingly that's how I consider, the CEOs and the PayPal mafia and the senior politicians. That's all they are. They are actors mouthing the words that they're told to mouth, and of course they can never go off script because actually they have no agency.
Yeah, and just to get your further thought on this, I was catching your recent appearance on Sonia Poulton's program, my ex virtual former colleague over at TNT Radio, who she does great work, and you guys were basically talking about this idea of limited hangout, these fake heroes, and this is something that, as you said earlier, is making some of us unpopular because there's this grift in alternative media. And just get your further thoughts. I always think there's a spectrum where there are, there's the security state is working within the alternative media. Number one. Number two, you've got people that maybe started out as genuine, but they're narcissistic, so they'll do anything to get following and money. And then there's this grift. So as you said earlier, if you go outside the bounds of the mainstream alternative media, you'll start losing money. And so they want to it's almost like a self-censorship. But then we're also seeing what these politicians like, we can go through the Trump administration right now. It's doing I argue that Trump he's effectively implementing the New World Order. RFK Jr. has done a 180. I just saw this week he hired Robert Malone on the vaccine committee, and it's like Malone again, as you're saying. This guy, his accounts everywhere on Substack. They blew up. He worked in the security biotech state, Malone. So it's almost like these people were positioned during COVID for this moment now to be put into place to further more insidiously advance the agenda. And you guys were talking about Brownstone, who did great work. And I've interviewed CJ Hopkins. I believe CJ told me back in 2020 when he came on, I had been the first video interview that he'd ever done. And he's going off on his X account on Brownstone and Jeff Tucker, because in a way, a lot of these folks who were COVID heroes have become Pied Pipers. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not, I think I was one of the first few hundred people, who signed the Great Barrington Declaration. I thought at least it was an alternative view. At least it was saying, all of the, sheltering vulnerable people. And so I think I've moved on from that. I think at the time, it was about stopping the control and coercion measures, and drawing attention to how ludicrous all of the nonsense was. But then, of course, we had the vaccine debate, and Jay Bhattacharya and his colleagues seemed to go strangely quiet on that. I think some of them went a little bit further, but now, of course, it's come out that Jay Bhattacharya was a good friend. I think he was a college friend or a school friend of Peter Thiel, and could it be that they're all interconnected in some ways? And you're right; they create a straw man. They put somebody, they laud people. I'm a great follower of a blogger in the UK. You may have come across Mary Finch. She runs a blog called Mary AF, and she makes the point that if you know their name, they're in the game. Because what they do is they will ignore anybody who, for example, says COVID was a scam. There was no disease. There was no virus. There was no effective vaccine. There was no need for a vaccine. There was no need for all of this 6-foot separation nonsense or wearing a mask between mouthfuls in restaurants. If you say that, you've gone a step too far. Once again, you've looked outside of the Overton window. And that's what they do. They will ignore anybody who has an alternative view and says what we're not supposed to say. It's all nonsense. Everything about COVID was nonsense. And of course, they had a captured media. And they will continue having a captured media, controlled media, because they cannot let us have any airtime or any visibility. But I think actually there is cut through, because people yearn for free thinkers. It's in our human nature. We seek them out. If everybody becomes a yes man or woman, we have to, in our very nature, maybe it's only a certain percentage of society, but we have to, in our very nature, seek out the thinkers, seek out people who have an alternative view. And I suppose deep down, I've always challenged authority. I've never found so-called experts telling me what to think right or morally justifiable. I always have to, I often use the quote from, I think it was Professor Richard Feynman, who said, it's much more interesting not knowing than to have answers that might be wrong. And I think that's why we do need these free thinkers. Okay, they might be niche audiences, and we might be called conspiracy theorists, but the alternative is coercion and control.
Yeah, and as you said, I've always, since I was a kid, it's like that one guy, that one guy in the corner on the outskirts who's questioning everything, and he's got this theory that's proving the official narrative false. I'm like, usually not, not always the case. There's a lot of wacky stuff. It's like, that guy's onto something, that he usually that person is right. And then you just made me think of what, as well, recently RFK Jr. and Jay Bhattacharya coming out and saying, oh, we've ended the recommendation for the COVID vaccine for children. And I'm like, really? That's the best? That's the best you can do? And then, Kristi Noem, the South Dakota former governor, comes out, and she's like, don't delay, get your real ID. And I was pointing this out this week. She says, oh, TSA has ended the Quiet Skies program. And I'm like, who cares? Because real ID is Quiet Skies on steroids. It's just kind of like, they've been put in place to sort of calm us down, to inject the morphine as we're going to go under the knife. And I guess your thoughts on the agenda then, how do you see, I think we've come to a point where many of us have come to the same conclusions. We are up against this totalitarian world state. How do you sort of summarize what is before us, the threat?
Well, it's clear that there are a number of kind of, I don't think it's as simple as is presented, and I haven't watched the full movie, but if you take Oracle's movie, The Agenda, I think there is a tendency, for us to seek kind of causality, to say, right, it's this group of people, they're supremely evil. But I tend to think it's slightly more nuanced. I think human beings, and particularly those people who are appointed to be leaders, have difficulty with complexity, and I think we live in a very, very complex world. And I think particularly those people who are kind of trying to organize it for their own benefit, it becomes very, very complex, because we have a number of competing interests. On the one hand, we've got the corporates, and you mentioned in one of your other interviews, I think again it was with Phil, you mentioned Gillette Corporation, for example, but you've got loads more, and many of them are either headquartered in London or the States. For example, Unilever. I think you can pretty much trace Unilever's origins right back to the British East India Company. So these people were running slaves, running opioid trade, are now heavily invested in pharmaceuticals, or the arms trade, and so there's pretty much a straight line from where they are now to where they have been, and of course then their major investors and shareholders tend to be those people who have vast amounts of intergenerational wealth. So there's that group of people who are pulling the strings at a corporate level, and it's kind of emerged from what essentially was organized crime. And Whitney Webb writes a lot about this, about the fact that you can trace the origins of many of the people now who are in Trump's front bench team all the way back to these sort of nefarious organizations and people who kind of own things, literally physically own an awful lot of the world's resources and supply chains. But then there's the kind of the Five Eyes network, the intelligence agencies. But they tend to be sort of entwined into those corporates in many ways. If you take Palantir as an example, Palantir was initially funded by the CIA. It then became a contractor to the CIA, then became a contractor, for example, in the United Kingdom to the NHS. Now, of course, the announcement of that they're going to be creating this master database for every US citizen. But it's very much a corporatized, agency entwined relationship. And then there's the Five Eyes network, which was created after the Second World War, was about collaboration between those nations that during the COVID era were the most fascist, and that sort of rings alarm bells for me. And it implies that there is a kind of collaboration between the Five Eyes nations, and they kind of define the Western agenda to a great extent. And that has a ripple effect through this sort of organized crime mafia and corporatist network as well. So I think there's elements of all of those three things interworking and playing out. But it's impossible, I think, to say that it's the WEF or a Bilderberg or Unilever or Palantir alone who are sort of controlling things. I think it is an organized, testosterone-fueled mess. And of course, it involves money and Wall Street as well. It's interesting that Howard Lutnick, for example, is, he wanted to be Treasury Secretary, but his agenda is to drive dollar stable coins as the sort of defining digital architecture, supposedly private sector digital architecture for the new era of money. And of course, if they own money and dollar hegemony, then they have cracked this particular nut. They will have global control. And of course, the CIA and the intelligence agencies are all over stablecoins. So it's an extraordinarily difficult thing to say it's those guys and not those guys. I think it's all in the mix. And I think there's a lot of sort of internecine squabbling that we don't get to see much about because it's jockeying for position and people trying to make hay, frankly, through totalitarianism.
Well, that's a great breakdown, and Bilderberg is underway as we speak in Stockholm, and there's some great folks on the ground. Dan Dix covering it, Josh Friedman, who I've had on the podcast, he's out there among a few others. I think Jacob Nordengard as well, who's a friend of the podcast. And you commented on Peter Thiel is the de facto president. Trump is a mere hired help from central casting. You've also a new era. Written about from MAGA to technocracy and Stargate derangement syndrome. And I just feel like it couldn't be any more obvious. I mean, you got Larry Ellison of Oracle coming out. I mean, the whole works. And just to get your further point on what you just mentioned, if they control the issuance of money digitally, I mean, we're talking about domination of the entire planet. And then my biggest fear is, to take from my past guest, Edwin Black's term, the algorithm ghetto, the social credit system. I mean, you can call it whatever you want, digital electronic concentration camp, where they're unifying a digital ID. You guys are getting BritCard now, being talked about the digital IDs, the digital currencies, the digital passports, and then you won't be able to function. It's effectively being put into a physical ghetto or prison. And for me, that's our number one threat because it's global. And if they succeed, there's no escape from it. You can flee Gaza, you can flee Ukraine, you can flee war zones, but you can't flee the 15-minute. I live in a smart city. It's crazy, And so, just any further thought on this threat?
Yeah, it's again, it relates to what I was just saying to you about the various constituencies who are driving the agenda. You've got within WEF a number of chapters or interest groups that are specifically focused on smart city developments. And what they're doing is they're seeding, and it's not even, interestingly, they're not actually giving governments money to deliver some of these things. They're essentially giving them vouchers. So they're saying, if you deliver a sort of smart city or if you announce that you're going to deliver smart city infrastructure, we'll give you a slug of money. And they're doing this in the United Kingdom in a number of cities. They've announced that London, Leeds, Belfast, and a variety of cities are going to be given, anywhere between $1 billion and $3 or $4 billion to develop smart city infrastructure. And that would include things like 15-minute cities. But what they expect, however, is that money all be spent on WEF partner companies. So they will nominate Huawei. And by the way, these companies are not exclusively Western. We had Rishi Sunak, for example. His father-in-law was CEO of a large Infosys, a large Indian company with its tendrils in just about every corner of central government in the United Kingdom, increasingly in the United States as well, often partnering with some of the software vendors that are developing surveillance technologies and so on. So this voucher system is being used to bribe city authorities and local politicians, and the money is being funneled through central government. But the same thing is happening in terms of organizations like BlackRock as well. I think one of the first things that Keir Starmer did when he became prime minister was to invite Bill Gates and Larry Fink to Downing Street to have a chinwag about what they were going to be doing in the United Kingdom. And this meeting happened just a few weeks before the Labour government announced that they were going to charge farmers inheritance tax for passing their farm on to their children. An area that was sacrosanct, that obviously a farm is a working business. It is not something that simply derives wealth to the offspring. But again, that's all about BlackRock and Gates clawing all of these assets from national governments. So I think, again, it's a very internecine web of connections that are driving this particular smart city agenda. I did an event during COVID. Actually, I was determined to run a physical event to discuss the whole issue of digital ID, and I had Bob Moran of the Daily Telegraph, or previously of the Daily Telegraph, along to talk about what his view was on digital ID. But even then, I think that was in the tail end of 2021, maybe early 2022. But even then, I think we could all see, those of us who were sufficiently awake, that digital ID was going to be the means by which they would implement full play totalitarian coercion. And of course, they attempted it during the COVID era by using the track and trace technologies and so on, interestingly sourced from the big tech companies in the United States, notably Google. So it's extraordinarily worrying, and obviously people like Musk are trailblazing in terms of embedding chips in our brains and so on. So I think the doomsday scenario would be that there would be a mandated use of biometrics. And of course, we can't get rid of our fingerprints, and if we do, we're unable to sign on for these services. But if they start using biometrics to track us and or give us permission to use services, then they've got us. That's full blown totalitarian. That's an Orwellian nightmare.
Yeah, I had Bob on the podcast a few years back. He's awesome, and back in 2020, I stated that COVID was about bringing in global oligocracy ruled by algorithm and AI, and the principal purpose was what you just described, to normalize QR codes, digital passports. In fact, I bought, it's on the shelf behind me, it's not standing, but on eBay from an Italian antique dealer for $10, the German Nazi Ahnen passes. I mean, you had the Ahnen pass, and then you had the other one, which was the actual health passport. But the Ahnen pass was to prove your biological Aryan purity. And I purchased that to sort of try and make a point during COVID. Like if I was asked for it at a shop or something, I pull out my Nazi Ahnen pass. Oh, you want me to prove my biological, with the COVID, it's like to prove your biological purity, that you took the test or you get the vaccine, you're biologically pure. You're not like the dirty, unvaccinated, and it's the same concept. Then, you come to realize IBM was helping the Nazi regime develop this totalitarianism. Who was, we can find reports, who was helping build out the COVID passports? IBM. Who was advising COVID policy? The Rockefellers, the same guys who were advising the Nazis. So it's like this, and then everything you just explained about all the corporations, it's the same thing going back then to now. And I think the technology has just advanced so much that now it's allowing them to actually be able to carry out what they have in mind. And I didn't want to ask you about just on the because you've talked about, I think, cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin. I don't know your exact position on Bitcoin. It's fine if we disagree. I kind of think it was planned by them to sort of
totally agree.
Yeah, so that totally agree. To whet our appetites to bring in CBDCs and just get your thoughts on that space, because it's now being integrated into the world financial system. In grocery stores in Bolivia, they're marking products, and Tether, Uber is integrating Bitcoin, and so we got some countries that use CBDCs and others that use what I call PBDCs, private bank digital currencies. But so basically, choose, you want 1984 or Brave New World, right? And so just your thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, I read Roger Ver's book. You're probably aware that Roger is kind of under house arrest in Mallorca in Spain at the minute, but he published a book, and he did an interview actually with Tucker Carlson, strangely. And Tucker Carlson, I'm confused. Is he controlled? Is he maybe part of the modus is to maybe tantalize us with some supposedly freedom-loving interview guests, and then go totally in the other directions, and it's all part of the agenda to confuse us as to who the good guys are. But Roger Ver's book, and he was, by the way, one of the architects of Bitcoin in the early days, and sort of broke away from the agenda when he realized that there was an overt agenda, I'll use that word again, within the Bitcoin community to turn Bitcoin away from being a secret peer-to-peer currency to become simply a store of value, and for the core network to use transacting in the asset, which it became, and making a lot of money from that transactional process. So the charges associated with transacting on the core Bitcoin network have escalated, meaning that people can only really trade their Bitcoin by using custodians. But to be honest, that's just one and the same, as buying any asset on any exchange or any share or share in a commodity. For example, you can buy and sell gold now in digital form, or tokens in digital form, using these custodians. But of course, all of that activity can be tracked and controlled and policed. And we saw during the era when the CIA clamped down on the Silk Road network, that of course, on a whim, the CIA can sequester Bitcoin. They can observe all of the transactions. It's highly traceable. And of course, now Tether has announced that they're working in partnership with the CIA. So if there's any trading of dollar stable coins on the Tether network that's of a suspicious nature, they can go in and sequester or take away organizations or individuals' wallets. So everything is being policed. Bitcoin is being policed. The custodians are being policed. And of course, the Tether network, and of course, Tether supposedly dollar stable coins. What are they pegged to? Not gold or silver or whatever. They're or even commodity prices. They're pegged to U.S. Treasury stock to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. And of course, the Commerce Secretary handily was CEO of their custodian, the organization that holds the Treasury stock on behalf of Tether. The CEO happens to be the new Commerce Secretary. So it's clear that this is all about extending the control grid. And Bitcoin, of course, if it becomes a Treasury asset, is just part of that same nefarious surveillance network.
Yeah, I've got Ver's book. I haven't been able to read it. That's my summer reading. I've got so many books to catch up on. Yeah, and I see it as you've explained it better than I could. One question that a lot of us have is the East, the multipolar worlds. And I've been arguing that I don't really see them doing anything different. If you look at Russia and China, they're with the same agenda. I mean, just this week we saw, Riley Waggaman. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's living in Russia. I've had him on the podcast. Russian papers talking about they're working on Russian scientists working on bug bread, right? So do you have any thoughts on the East? Are they on board with the same agenda? Are they fighting against it?
I suspect they probably are. I think again, I mentioned earlier this sort of straw man approach that they tend to take. Putin was sort of, Trump didn't during his campaign, his presidential campaign, made clear that he would end the war with Ukraine practically overnight. In fact, I think he was hinting that he would be on the phone to Putin and they would put an end to it pretty much immediately. That hasn't happened, of course. Now with the Israeli invasion of Iran, there, certain hawkish members of the House of Representatives, one in particular who happens to be in Florida. And do you remember when DeSantis was lauded as being, a freedom lover? And of course, but on Israel, that's maybe a step too far, So now we're hearing noises that, that this will engulf when Israel continues bombing Iran, that this will engulf Russia. We might end up with a similar situation to Syria, where we have very, very odd goings on between the United States and, for example, the Emirates or Saudi getting involved in the whole thing. I don't know. It seems to be a stitch up. Every geopolitical scenario always involves the same players, and I think you're right to hint at the fact that perhaps Putin and the rest of them and China are all playing the same game, which would imply, of course, that the ultimate agenda is global government. They all want the same things. The Chinese clearly want to be able to, with their credit scoring systems and their digital IDs and their digital currencies, they want the same output as Palantir seems to want in the United States, and that Keir Starmer and Tony Blair want to put in place in the United Kingdom. So I think this whole power play is simply that we lose trust in our national governments, that they are seen to be unable to control anything without the power players right at the top riding in and solving things and creating a peaceful environment. Somebody described it recently as that the move increasingly towards digital technologies is akin to trading off our freedoms in favor of convenience or comfort. And I think that's going to be happening at a geopolitical level. If you want an end to all of these wars, guys, you need to be able to allow us to control you. You know, we will allow you to live in peace and comfort. And I think they're all pretty much in the same game. You know, like even Putin never came out and said that COVID was a scam, did he? You know, he was peddling his own Sputnik vaccine. The Chinese were peddling theirs, and the West was left to peddle our mRNA nonsense. I think perhaps they're all in the same game.
No, you are 1,000% on point. Putin came and he doubled down on the narrative. He came out like in a biohazard suit, and he took the vaccine and whatnot. And so I think you're on point. You just explained it, that they all want global government, and I think any rivalry is they're fighting for the biggest slice of the pie. That's really what the conflict is about. And it's like two cartels or two mafias where, you know, they were under the impression, the East, that they would have a equal seat at the table, and the Western mafia is kind of like, no, you guys are going to sit further down. And, you know, and the Russians and the Chinese like, no, we're not down with that. And I'm forgetting what else I was going to say, but I think that's pretty much it.
Yeah, it's also you hit the nail on the head there too. I think it's about creating fear of scarcity. You know, so you had you know, when Russia invaded Ukraine, and even prior to that, there was a lot of talk, particularly from the Republicans, about the Nord Stream pipeline. You know, they were saying, oh, you know, Russia's going to have a direct supply right into Europe, right into Germany. And this is terrible. You know, we should be selling American oil. And Trump has been rehashing this argument. And then and Trump recently in an interview sort of implied that he thought it was a good thing that the Nord Stream pipeline was blown up. So they create a fear of scarcity. We had it during COVID. You know, everybody was buying toilet rolls. And then when they rolled out the vaccine, everybody was afraid they weren't going to get their vaccine. And, you know, and then there was a squabble between the United Kingdom and Europe because apparently the United Kingdom was first, you know, to market with its AstraZeneca vaccine and was denying supply to the European Union. It was all orchestrated nonsense, but it's always about creating this feeling that there's going to be scarcity in this. There's going to be scarcity in oil. There's going to be scarcity in gas. And ironically, actually, recently, the gasoline prices or, you know, crude oil prices have been slumping because there has actually been a decline in global demand for fossil fuels because of all of the net zero nonsense. You know, so it's always about creating scarcity, and it's always a justification for the land grab that's going on as well. But the only people who suffer from all of this are the ordinary people who have to pay through the nose. So even though the crude oil prices are slumping, they're still charging more and more at retail to ordinary consumers who can, in many cases, barely eat or pay their energy bills. So it is definitely about land grabbing and creating false scarcity when there is no such thing. And that's absolutely front and center of the technocratic argument. It's about energy being in short supply. You know, it's about energy being the thing that has to be traded, even though it's in plentiful supply. And I interviewed on my website a guy in Africa, a farmer, a small holding farmer, and he was attacked by the BBC Verify team as being a conspiracy theorist, because the guy was simply saying that he needed to buy diesel to power a tractor, you know, and he couldn't, you know, because the entry point of buying a tractor as a small holding farmer in Africa was, you know, it was like unattainable. And even getting diesel fuel for the tractor would have been very, very difficult for him as well. And he simply started making the argument that, you know, we need fossil fuels in Africa. We need fossil fuels in order to see the economic development that you guys have seen in the West. And what happened? BBC Verify outed him as being a conspiracy theorist, as being paid off by the oil companies. You know, this was all nonsense. And his name is Jasper. His surname escapes me at the minute, but it's on my website. But here was an instance of somebody saying this scarcity that I'm being told that exists for me as a smallholding farmer is wrong. It's nonsense. I should be, people should be supplying me with oil, and I should be able to buy an affordable tractor. And for that, the BBC, state-funded broadcaster of the United Kingdom, came down on him like a ton of bricks, and I thought that was utterly offensive to any basic notions that we have that we live in a free democratic society.
Oh, so I know who you're talking about. I follow him, Jasper Machogu, and I've been meaning to
Jasper
interview.
Machogu. Yeah,
I've been meaning to get him on as well. I'm gonna check your back archive on that, and yeah, basically, I mean, you're talking about. I like to call it Death Zero, right? Net zero,
yeah.
Death Zero, the green agenda, and it's all about neo-feudalism, re-implementing feudalism and erasing the middle class, and we're seeing that across the board. Housing. I talk to people where I live in Mexico. Housing in the past decade has tripled. Food and energy at least doubled. Salaries have stayed the same. You can't tell me that this isn't intentional. And I wanted, we're reading stuff like Japanese are queuing for rice now. Just a crazy example. And I keep going back to a lot. I really love sci-fi. And I recently watched the adaptation of Childhood's End, Arthur C. Clarke. And I'm still sort of amazed by the visual adaptation where these overlords come to Earth, they cure all illness and end peace, but there's a catch. Eventually, they take all the children, and humanity dies out, and they blow up the planet. And it's kind of like with the world government folks. And I read a book outlines The City of Man. Warren Wager was a disciple of H.G. Wells in 1970. He wrote a book how he's basically arguing, look, we should have nuclear war to blow up the planet, so then we can have our world government. I'm like, these people are insane.
Yes. Utterly deranged. Yeah, I know. Well, and of course, what is the world for? We are a species that has excelled. We have managed to feed all of these people, admittedly with maybe junk food, but we have managed through leapfrog technologies to feed a global population. And yet we're told, well, that's not good enough. We need because global warming, and we need to slack. And essentially, that's what they're saying. There was a slip of tongue that Bill Gates did. Or was it a slip of tongue? Apparently, it's on the Bilderberg Group agenda, depopulation. But what the hell sort of world is it going to be where I visited just last week. My wife and I went to a hotel which was in the middle of a gigantic private sector housing development in Spain called Soto Grande. Soto Grande, I think, is one of the biggest private residential developments anywhere in Europe. But essentially, this was zoned housing for billionaires. And still is, and the hotel is beautiful but it's right in the middle of Soto Grande. And in order to get into Soto Grande, you have to go through a security control, and you drive through these streets, and there's streets, and it's a small town. It's not just a little private housing development. It is a small town of homes built for billionaires, and most of them are empty because these houses are owned by people who probably have 10, 20 houses all over the world. And therefore, it is utterly soulless. These people live in a community where there's no other people. And that essentially is the end game that they are seeking, to live out their latter years with no human comfort, no human socializing, no going to the pub and having a pint. In the United Kingdom, I think in the last, since the COVID era, it's something like 15,000 public houses, pubs have closed. All of these small business owners have gone to the wall. It's almost impossible to make a living in the restaurant trade any longer without charging the customer an absolute fortune. But that is the utopia that they're seeking, a world without people, without children. What the hell? What is their end game? Is that how sad they have become? The people aren't being given the right to vitality and engaging in their own choices and living their own lives. And we have achieved as a species more than any other, frankly, clearly, obviously. And yet they see that as all wrong, that is in some way acting against the best interests of the planet. Bizarre.
It's insane. And kind of what you explained made me think of, again, Matt Damon's film Elysium, where they're creating these walled off city states for themselves. And then the rest of us are left in Mad Max world. I'm not sure if I came across this account recently on X and Telegram. Vinny Sullivan, I think is his name. He gives pub tours in around London, and what you just mentioned, he's been talking about we need to keep that old culture. I've never been to UK, but he's talking about how the pubs are being shut down, and that's part of that sort of traditional culture, and it's being done away with. We've pretty much covered the waterfront. Is there anything I haven't brought up that you think is important, as well as, what can we do? Sort of for me at this point is I'll die speaking truth to power. I think that's one of the biggest things we can do, is just speaking the truth no matter what, and then making preparations to survive whatever insanity they throw at us.
Yeah, I do see some chinks of light. One is the death of politics. I think nobody in their right mind could invest much time in political parties or political leaders. I think we're definitely coming to the end of democracy as it's currently defined. And that means that I think whole new vistas will open up. Is it going to be the era of the individual? I think individuals are, frankly, putting out much more content that is much more interesting. And therefore, I think we're going to see the death of mainstream media. The only reason mainstream media is surviving is because it's propped up by governments. The two are one and the same organizations, entities. In the United Kingdom, as a case in point, we have a state broadcaster in the BBC. The BBC was front and center of the Trusted News Initiative, which essentially became a censorship organization. We just mentioned Jusper, where BBC Verify. Supposedly, the bit of BBC that provides us with the verification that we need, that everything they're putting out is trusted. When we went through a period when the BBC just put out nothing but propaganda. I remember the last time I appeared, the BBC used to contact me every week and ask me to appear on their programs because I was seen to be someone of the right, So I was asked to take part in their programs and, typically go against somebody who was nominally of the left. And it was a sort of set piece confrontation, which is what they love, of course. But I appeared on the BBC on December the 18th, 2020. And it was a set piece where they had the chief medical officer of the part of the United Kingdom that I live in, who was given a half-hour set piece interview. And then they came to me, and it was during the period when they were encouraging people to get tested for COVID. And anyway, there was a discussion. They kept cutting me off because they had loads of people on the panel who were saying the right things as far as the BBC were concerned. But then they came back to us and asked us for a final thought. And the only thing I could think of in the spur of the moment was to advise people who were listening to the program to not get tested. I said, under no circumstances get tested. If you get tested, you're entering. And at that point, I was cut off air, But that's what we need to do. I think we don't get on to mainstream media, but we need to still keep airing these views. And that's why I say to you, what you're doing, and in my own much smaller way, because my output is much less than yours, but we need to keep challenging. We need to keep saying we're still here. we still have free minds. We still have our own logic. We still have our own children's future to think of. And we just need to keep stirring up a stink, because otherwise they'll just ride over us. But the chink of light is the fact that we invest no trust whatsoever in our media organizations, and we invest no trust whatsoever in our politicians or those actors who are appointed as our political leaders. So I think in that respect, I think we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I think you're right. I didn't know you were on BBC. That's hilarious, and I think that's what we need to do, and even just to remind the people around us, shopkeepers, government officials, that we're not going to comply. I was talking to an Uber driver. Extortion is common here in Mexico, and he was telling me how 2 female transit police attempted to, because they say, oh, the females are less corrupt. No, they were trying to extort him. He had all his papers in order. And he called the cops on the cops. He called the Mexican police on the transit police, and that's kind of like a way of saying, I'm not paying your bribe. Where I'm not. You're to maintain truth. And what are the words? Justice and ethics and morals. And you made me think of one of my past guests, really good Swiss journalist Guy Maton. I interviewed him a few years ago, and he talked about that. He was pessimistic about the future, but he also is optimistic because he thinks the light of the truth, even if it is small, even if it is only a candle, that this is worth it. It brings light. And then eventually at some point, people will keep repeating the truth. And he used the example of Christians in the Roman Empire who were almost blotted out, but then eventually the tables turned, right? And they took over, the Roman Empire. So I think that's basically what we got to keep doing. So if you have any final thought for us.
I think the one difficulty we have, and I think it's the case in the United States, it's certainly the case in the United Kingdom, is that we essentially have people on a social credit system already, and that's people who are employed directly or indirectly by the government. And I think one of the tactics they have used, and this is a tactic that's been used in 2 ways. They've increased the money supply, they've printed money, and they've increased state employment, as I say, either directly or indirectly. And indirectly would include by contracting organizations like Palantir. And so what they have essentially is they just give out all of these tokens and bribes to people working in the public sector who can go no place else. And of course, in the United Kingdom, it's even worse in that they're guaranteed huge pensions if they get to retirement age and are still in the public sector. And I think that's probably one of the most difficult things we're presented with. The fact that so many people are so dependent on the state that they're not prepared to say anything. I'm lucky in that I got to an age during COVID when I didn't really need to, because behind me were all of these burning bridges where I couldn't work with any of the clients, most of whom were corporate clients in the tech sector. I couldn't work with them. I certainly couldn't work with government. But I was in the lucky position of being financially independent enough, myself and my wife, to be able to continue and being a bit mouthy. But a lot of people just can't do that. But I think the thing that we need to get across to them is that this is not going to continue. This isn't these bribes are not going to continue into perpetuity. They will not be able to pay the pensions. Many of our supposed global currencies will crash. The United States, what is it, $38 trillion of debt? How can this continue? So I think the challenge we have is convincing people who perhaps haven't thought as much as they should have to maybe start putting their thinking caps on.
Yeah, and even the police or whatever, they're slowly being replaced by robocops, right? By drones and AI, and so they'll teachers at my former place of employment. Only one colleague of mine, they here in Mexico, was actually against the law, but they were firing people who didn't get injected. And then, according to Mexican law, you can fire companies can fire anyone they want at any point. But if you do it without good cause, you actually have to pay a severance package to that person, and so only one person was. But the rest of the teachers eventually, AI is coming in, slowly taking over teaching. But yeah, I'd agree with you on your principle, as well as just the principle of how can I look my children and my grandchildren in the eye, not having stood up against COVID 1984 and all of this madness, the wars, and all that. And so, really great chat, Jeff. Your links are in the description. Are the best places to find you? Are they X and your website?
Yeah, I'm Jeffrey Peel on with a J, the American way. Jeffrey Peel on Twitter. I prefer to call it Twitter. The New Era.uk. It's on Substack, but it's the New Era.uk is my blog. And as I say, in due course, I'll be putting out details of my book, which will hopefully be published around about September time. So I'm up against my editor is waiting for the first draft by the end of this month. So fingers crossed.
Well, good luck with that. I look forward to checking out your novel, and yeah, keep up the great work. And thanks for coming on Geopolitics and Empire.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me.